Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure. It's my great pleasure to open this new panel for our conference dedicated to the question of democracy in what is often described as a post-liberal international order. We are joined by three distinguished scholars whose work has shaped how we understand democracy, political development, and international politics. Professor Daniel Server, Professor Rolf Enedi, and Professor Kenneth Green, who just had the keynote speech. I am personally very pleased to moderate the discussion among colleagues and friends, some of them long-time friends. And I am confident that we will have not only an analytically rich exchange, but also a genuinely engaged debate. Let me begin with a brief framing of the issue that brings us together. For much of the post-Cold War period, the dominant assumption in both academic and policy circles was that liberal democracy represents the endpoint of political development. The language of consolidation, transition, and democratic diffusion reflected a broader expectation that the world was unevenly but steadily moving toward the liberal democratic equilibrium. Today, this assumption is under strain. This is the question I will start with, and thanks to Zsolt's presence here, we will definitely talk something about hot topic of today. It is Hungarian, I would not say regime change, but the change that maybe comes one in the epoch, like in the 1999. So I have an opening question for all three panelists. Refer to post-liberal international order. Do you believe we are truly entering in post-liberal era? Or we are witnessing a crisis and transformation of liberalism rather than its end? Academically speaking, we can say, are we now in one of the Huntington's counterwaves against democracies, or we are entering some completely new international order? Is it a temporary situation that still is there, or we can hope for the better days? So whoever is willing to start for this very core question.
Thank you very much for being invited, and it's great to be here. I don't have a definite answer to this question. The most recent publication of the VDEL team showed that in terms of quality of democracy, the world is in the worst place in the last 50 years. So in that regard, we are really at a very low point. And it seems that it's not only that we have autocratization within autocracies and shifts from competitive authoritarian regimes to autocracies, but there is also quite a few examples of liberal democracies becoming either non-liberal democracies or non-democracies at all. Having said that, I think it's better to speak about the struggle than about evolutionary decline. And that's partly because there are many other aspects of quality of democracy that our instruments are not very good at picking on, like how, let's say, in terms of transparency, countries change. So the way how, let's say, Western Europe has changed in the last 50 years, I think it's remarkable, and you don't think of it as any kind of structural change. It is more a kind of very gradual, largely invisible way of altering our environment. If we would look at the way how politics was done 50 years ago in most European countries, you would be appalled. say that these are not democracies. They don't comply with the standards that we have today. So we have to be sensitive to this less visible aspect of improvement. But it's true that in terms of our hopes and in terms of how technologically we progress, the political aspect has deteriorated in the last 20, 30 years in a very spectacular fashion, and we have to find answers why.
Thank you, George. Daniel?
Well, I want to focus on the United States, which I think is the key issue at the moment.
Great.
We are in a moment of clear deconstruction of our state and deconstruction of our democracy. I don't think there's any doubt about that. How did it happen? Well, all of us are used to an America that was liberal democratic at home and wanted to sell liberal democracy abroad. But that America existed only since the 1960s. I'm old enough to remember the 1960s, and even before. And before 1964, you had a situation in America where black people in the South didn't vote. They couldn't vote, most of them. You had an America before World War II where one of the dominant political forces was pro-fascist. The America Firsters, which is what they called themselves, were pro-Mussolini and some of them pro-Hitler. The liberal democratic America that has dominated our lives has existed, really it was gestated during World War II. And then it was born in the Cold War in opposition to another autocracy, which was communist. That liberal democratic America has now suffered a very broad attack from inside, not from outside, from inside. And it's a resurgence of racism and Christian nationalism that I find better recognized in the Balkans as what it is, which is ethnic nationalism, than it's recognized in the United States, because ethnic nationalism is not an expression that we use in our own politics. But that's what it is. It's a balkanization of the United States. I never anticipated that when I met Sergeant for the first time 30 years ago that would happen. But that's what has happened. I think it's very difficult to answer the question, where is it headed next? If I have my preferences, I know where it's headed next. It's headed to burial in the midterm elections and defeat in the next presidential election. But I don't think there's any guarantee of that. And the reason is very important. American elections, you cannot predict the outcome before they happen. Even good pollsters can't predict the outcome before they happen. And that's the good thing about American democracy. So I can't bemoan the fact that people I don't agree with won the last election. They won the last election. I hope they don't win the next election. But I've monitored elections as an observer in Georgia, the last election. And I can tell you that the electoral mechanism in Georgia is in terrific condition. It is rock solid. And I think that's true for most of the country, largely because of the challenges that have been brought against it in recent years. So I'm pretty confident it will hold a free but maybe not fair election next time around. Then why do I say that? I say that because of the redistricting that's occurring now. The American political system is based on the notion that all people are created equal. That's what it says in the Declaration of Independence. But it's never really been true. The Constitution actually gave less populous states more power through the Senate. It gave more representation to states with slaves than they were entitled to based on their voting population. The redistricting battle that's occurring now, I don't know how well this is known here, but essentially the Supreme Court has decided that you can redistrict House seats, that is, House of Representatives, based on political party, but not based on race. So you can make all of the districts in Maryland Democratic, even though there are lots of Republicans in Maryland. And you can make all the districts in Georgia or in South Carolina, more pertinently, South Carolina, Republican, even though there are lots of non-Republicans in South Carolina. So we're going to have a free election, I think, but not a very fair one. And fortunately, there's no way of predicting how it will come out because it will be decided on election day.
Thank you, Daniel. Ken, as we are talking about the United States, Steve Levitsky and Volkan Veh have already published articles on American authoritarianism. I believe that it is more difficult to impose authoritarianism in the United States in a full scale than in, let's say, Chile or some other Latin American country in history, or Turkey, or what do you think about it? Is it possible? As I can see, electoral arena is still vibrant, judiciary is still resilient. So, what are the prospects? Will it be really decided on elections in 2028, 27, or it is more deep problem? Started in the beginning of the 90s with Newt Gingrich rise to power and the others. So, how it looks like to you?
Let me see if I can make some comments about the framing question and about the U.S.
Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah. So, Fukuyama famously said that we were at the end of history with the fall of communism, which clearly turned out to be a mirage. And so are we entering a stage of a post-liberal era or an episode of crisis with liberal renewal? Clearly an incredibly difficult question to answer. I think we need to start with the question of where we are descriptively. And I have to say that I struggle with this question quite a bit. I look around and I certainly see the rise of the liberal politics in a number of countries and significant threats to democracy. But the threats vary across countries, and they're a little bit hard to categorize. I just want to mention, I made reference to the varieties of democracy data, and I believe you did too. It's common to use these data, but they're very difficult data to use to understand where we are currently. The raters are experts, people like me, who are affected by all kinds of bias and emotions. We're not objective raters, and so it's hard to kind of think about the underlying scheme as completely objective. And then the ratings are put into a scale, a democracy scale, that has no particular meaning at any point on the, from 0 to 1. So we say that countries count as either democracies or non-democracies based on some artificial cutoff point. There's no particular reason to think of 0.5 on the scale of 0 to 1 as the threshold between democracy and non-democracy. I find myself reading Levitsky and Ziblatt and thinking all is lost. Things are terrible. And then I find myself reading one of my colleagues, Kurt Galen, and thinking, it's bad, but it's not that bad. I can be swayed. My lens shifts. So where are we going from here? I think quite a lot depends on economic matters. Young people seem to be committed liberals in so many countries around the world, but incredibly concerned about their economic future and willing to trade those principles for more economic stability. So what happens in the confrontation between the U.S. and China? Do we make it through this current AI bubble? Are we on the path to continue prosperity, or are we going to enter a period of significant difficulty? If the latter, then I think illiberal politics is on the rise. If the former, I think there's hope for a liberal renewal and comeback. I do think that this liberal renewal will have significant differences from the prior system. I think we're going to end up with more restrictions on immigration across Europe and the U.S. I think we're going to end up with a system that has more executive power and therefore is more susceptible to the whims of the incumbent. So I do think those represent significant problems looking toward the future. But I think keying off of my initial presentation earlier today, I have to take the optimistic perspective.
Thank you, Ken. Daniel, please, we used to live for decades in the system, the international order, where the United States have been not only, actually have been the biggest European military power. But it is not about military power. It is about some kind of a guardianship of democracy all over. And Europe could have developed their welfare states, liberal democracies, under that kind of a shield. Now we have completely different United States in the international arena, challenging, luckily still verbally, challenging even NATO, the very creation of America.
Well, I think the situation is very clear. The Trump administration does not support the European Union and cannot be relied upon to protect Europe militarily. Article 5 is for the moment unusable. Now that doesn't mean that NATO is completely useless. Article 5 is only used once in defense of the United States. But of course it's extremely important for deterrence effect every day. I don't think it has the same deterrent effect today that it had a year ago. I think Europe needs to stand up more to defend itself and is standing up more to defend itself. That said, the current situation, which casts doubt on Article 5 and on NATO and resistance to the European Union, has very definite implications in the Balkans. And I want to talk about that just for a moment. you cannot expect Montenegro to have support for its EU membership from the United States. The paper published last week by the State Department fails to mention the European Union. And it fails to mention it because it doesn't like it. It regards it as competitive, not as constructive. For NATO, you're already in. The important parts of NATO today have to do with the exercises, the coordination planning, the intercomparability. And those are the things that now all NATO members should refocus on. Article 5 isn't going to work if Vladimir Putin decides to do something. I don't believe the Baltics can even depend on the United States at this point. Fortunately, I think Russia is starting to lose the war in Ukraine, unlikely to rekindle something someplace else. The Americans have decided in favor of a transactional diplomacy, and they're willing to cooperate with what they call local leaders. I keep on telling people in the State Department, it all depends on who those local leaders are. If they are Milorad Dodik, you get one kind of cooperation, and it can be very, very damaging. If it's Jakub Finci, it's another kind of cooperation. But they don't care at this point. They are willing to ignore who it is they're cooperating with in favor of transactional deals that appear to bring benefits to the United States. And that foreign policy is very, very different from what you're used to.
Thank you. Then, here in Europe, in the democracy backsliding era, one example is starkly shining. At the moment, it is, of course, Hungary. And we are happy that Zsolt is today with us. I've heard already several of his excellent interviews explaining what's going on, what happened, and let us use the opportunity to ask him something about it. First of all, it is the era of the democracy backsliding. Why it is so difficult to fight for democracy today, and why Hungarians succeeded. Do you think the Hungarian case clearly shows the limits of electoral authoritarian consolidation and can be a hope for the others? And finally, I would ask you, and we will continue the discussion about it, something about personality of new leader and his patriotic symbol. Who is the guy?
How much time do I have?
The floor is yours, as much as you want.
Because I did collect a couple of factors for these questions, so I will very quickly go through them. So let me start with the factors that make a democratization difficult in the 21st century. So today we have quite many competitive authoritarian regimes where in principle the table can be turned, and we heard from the keynote lecture that the capacity is there, but still it doesn't really happen, or if it happens it's partial. So why is it so difficult to mobilize people against illiberal rule? Let me go through some of the factors that I think play a bigger role today than in the past. One interesting factor is that most of the projects of democratization today are projects of re-democratization. So we have cases when there was a democratic period before. And I think re-democratization is a little bit different from democratization. It's easier to some extent to democratize if there is an experience of previous democracy, because there are some skills in place, but it's also more difficult because those players who were associated with a failed democratic period obviously have no legitimacy. And Venezuela is a kind of a classical example of that. Then the global context that is in the title of our section. So today, there is still a support for democratization in the West, but this West is fragmented, polarized, with very little trust, and with the ascendancy of radical forces. And on the other side, you see not only a very aggressive and assertive Russia, but you see also a very economically successful China and United States. Now, all these powers are shaping now a new world order whose contours is not clear yet, but it is already quite obvious that spheres of influence matter more than in the past. You have a United States that respects strength and doesn't respect the rule of law. You have Russia that has a kind of anti-fascist rhetoric, but reproduces many phenomena of fascism. And that also includes nowadays kind of arch conservatism. And you have a China that is much less aggressive in rhetoric than the other two. But when you look at the ideology they promote, what they talk about in this Belt and Road Initiative and other documents is that they want not universal values, but common values. And the difference between the two, that in common values, you don't have human rights, you don't have constraints on government, you don't have state neutrality and so on. So we are in a new world order, and that is not good for democratization and redemocratization. Then the other interesting factor is that our illiberal regimes are not as illiberal as they should be in some sense. So they allow a large amount of freedom of speech and privacy. So they are not so bad. Hybrid regimes, they are not so bad as in the past. You can have media streaming services, online shopping services accessible in virtually all countries on the world. You can have access to private education, private media channels, you can travel abroad, you can exit from the system, you can circumvent the rules in various ways, which means that there is no urgency. Business can thrive. There is a kind of tolerance in today illiberal regimes that makes it difficult to create a sense of urgency against the authoritarian leadership. Then there is institutional isomorphism between democracies and non-democracies. There is little difference in how they are structured. 21st century autocratization is not about grand institutional designs and changing fundamental rules. It's about what I call the gerrymandering of the state itself, redrawing the competencies of various public bodies. And this is not something that is easily politicizable for the ordinary citizens. For them, all these debates about these institutional rules are arcane and elitist, and they understandably stay out of them. Then there is no clear social content to the democratization project. Post-communist change was about markets, was about nation, but it had a clear social message. Today, the democratizers are divided. One kind of new social system. They want one more pro-market, other one more egalitarian, and so on. There is also ambiguity and attitudinal divides. So not only that quite a few autocratizers used to be Democrats once upon a time, like Erdogan, Orban, and many others, so they can have this revolutionary legitimacy. But also you see enormous amount of cynicism among Democrats. So, trust in the rule of law and trust in politicians and so on is very, very low. And what creates a particularly difficult situation that many of these illiberal regimes have opposition parties that are even more illiberal than the illiberal regimes. So democratizers don't need simply to outnumber the regime supporters. They also need to outnumber everybody who is illiberal, that means part of the opposition. Then there is another problem today. We don't have negotiated transitions. So the psychological conditions for negotiated path of transition is not really there, because there was a democracy not long ago in many of these countries. So the Democrats are outraged, morally outraged about what the autocrats did, and they don't want to forgive them. You know, if you remember Spain, how Spain transited to democracy, there was a lot of moderation on both sides, understanding that you have to give space to both sides. Today, neither side wants to compromise. The Democrats don't want, because they say that, well, these were criminals who took away democracy from us. The autocrats don't want to compromise because they say that the world is going in a non-liberal direction. So why should we jump on a sinking ship of liberal democracy when liberal democracy is over, basically? Then another interesting phenomenon is that global discourse shapes domestic discourse to a larger extent than in the past. Now we talk about global affairs more in our domestic media, and interestingly, that's good for the autocratizers, because they have a story to tell us, and the story is that the world is dominated by CNN, IMF, all these liberal institutions, and we have to fight against these global dominant players. Yes, we cheat. Yes, we use violence. Yes, we manipulate. But this is the only way to preserve our identity. We need diversity at the global level. If we don't do what we do, our way of life will disappear. Interestingly, the liberal Democrats focus on national affairs, and the autocrats focus on global affairs. And finally, culture war. So culture war is something that played very much in the hands of autocratizers, and you see how they tap into this conservative outrage about many of the progressive changes, and how the language between Putin and Trump and Xi Jinping and so on is held by these conservative, illiberal intellectuals, how Bolsonaro and Orban and Erdogan can come to the same table saying that they protect family and religion and so on. Now, Hungary is a bit of an outlier in some sense. Simply, one thing is that we had 16 years of illiberal rule, and in a way that was one of the reasons why Orban was simply people were, 16 years is a long time. The other thing is that there was no economic growth for a long time, and at the same time there was this spectacular enrichment of cronies of Fidesz that was really irritating for everyone. And then the regime ran into various scandals, especially pedophilia scandal that really hurt the regime. Also, there was another scandal that not many people talk about outside of Hungary, but I think it was important in Hungary that Orban thought that money will come from China and Asia, so invested very much in electric battery plants that turned out to be polluting. So the negative reaction to those plants were quite important. But what is more structural is the rift with EU. Orban played earlier this game of kind of getting money from EU and criticizing EU at the same time, but EU put an end to that at one point, and Hungarians realized that they have to choose between the two models, and there was always a pro-European majority. Then Orban kind of lost touch with reality, partly because he was so much impressed by his stardom as a liberal player in the world. He was not interested anymore in Hungary, and also feedback mechanisms around him deteriorated to a very large extent. There was also some minor rebellion in civil service in the last days of the campaign, where some policemen, some military officers came out against him. That was something that he didn't expect. Then I in generally lost touch with younger generation by staying too conservative. He took this too seriously. Then there was a very specific story that Meta and Google stopped political advertising in EU, and Orban very much relied on this edge, and he lost them, and he was not able to replace them. And finally, I mean, this general being focused on global affairs as opposed to domestic affairs, that also meant that he had a very far-fetched, misfocused campaign, very much focused on Ukraine and not on social services. And he got very close to Trump, Putin, and also radical right-wingers in Romania and Slovakia, in countries that they are our traditional enemies. So he kind of thought that he can rewrite history by creating an illiberal alliance of radical right-wing forces everywhere, which was really a very brave idea, and it worked for a while, but ultimately failed. And very last points about what did Magyar do right, because I think that takes us to what we can do about illiberal leaders, maybe worldwide. One is some things that you cannot learn, like charismatic leadership, but what you can learn is grassroots mobilization, really going to every single town in the country. Then a kind of very interesting concentration of the vote on one party that was achieved in a not through negotiation, but basically intimidating any other opposition party. So all other opposition parties basically withdrew, or most of them. Then relying on the very independent and innovative new media environment that was created by activists in the last 5-6 years, with a lot of crowdfunding. That was a major innovation. A lot of focus on vote buying. We understand that this is not the number one reason why illiberals stay in power, but that 5-6% that can decide an election can depend on vote buying, and activists were very much focused on trying to stop that, and they were able to achieve considerable success. And finally, and that is the answer to what Magyar is, he is a patriot, and the way how nationalist symbols were used in his campaign provides, I think, a recipe, a kind of blueprint for those who want to fight illiberal rulers. He appropriated nationalist symbols and tweaked them. So now, when we had the inauguration of the new parliament and government, we had a lot of nationalism in terms of all the symbolic representation, but we also had the Ode of Joy, the anthem of Europe, and we had the anthem of Roma, Gypsies in Hungary. All of that together, creating a kind of new sort of national unity that was not there before.
Thank you, Zsolt. It was really extensive and great explanation. Ken, please, you made a seminal work in researching competitive authoritarianism, why dominant party lose on Mexican case. Many contemporary regimes still maintain elections, constitutions, and democratic institutions while simultaneously weakening liberal norms and checks on power. Do you believe hybrid regimes are, in spite of that, inherently unstable? Or electoral authoritarianism or competitive authoritarianism can become a kind of a long-term equilibrium?
Thank you. I see that I haven't completely convinced everybody that vote buying typically fails. So I have a little bit more work to do. Please send me your address. I'll send you the book when it comes out in August, and we'll take up this issue again. I think that the idea that vote buying must work is very sticky. Let's see. I prepared a few thoughts on the prior question, so let me circle back to the current question in just a moment. Clearly, the U.S. is withdrawing from the world, and the center of gravity of the liberal democratic world has shifted to Europe for the time being. So much depends on the extent to which Germany, France, and the UK can constrain its far-right parties. I do have, not to sound like a broken record with the same theme, but I do have a bit of optimism about the U.S. re-engaging in a more serious way with the rest of the world after the Trump administration, beyond the transactional kind of relationships that he is so avidly pursuing now. Among leaders, what are the possibilities? Well, we don't know, obviously, but maybe Rubio ends up being the Republican nominee. He's clearly an internationally minded person and not beholden to the MAGA mindset to the same extent. And of course, any kind of Democratic leader would re-engage with the world. Much of the institutional architecture has been dismantled, but not for such a long period of time that the expertise doesn't still exist. So I think that we can rebuild a lot of the internationally oriented institutions. I also think that public support for re-engagement might increase. Episodes of health disasters around the world really bring this to light, like the current Ebola crisis happening. The inevitable human rights atrocities that we'll see on our TV sets, and unfortunately episodes of economic crisis will all encourage public support for re-engagement. So I have a sense of optimism that once we bridge the Trump period, that if we bridge the Trump period, that we will, that the U.S. will re-engage with the world, and that at that point, Europe will have become a stronger fighter for democracy internationally. What about competitive authoritarian regimes? Can they be a long-term kind of stasis? I'd say medium-term for sure. I mean, I'll go back to the Mexico example. I didn't think it was possible, but had been proven wrong. The incumbent Moreno party has established itself as the new dominant party in Mexico, despite the privatization of state-owned enterprises really slimming the public budget. It's managed to consolidate fiscal authority in the executive branch to such an extent that it uses its resource advantages over the opposition. It now dominates all three branches of government, and it's tilted the partisan playing field so much in its favor that it's very difficult to see exactly how you exit this period of electoral authoritarianism, with one potential exception, and that has to do with the weakness of the state. Mexico, like many other countries, has fairly weak state institutions that struggle mightily to serve the interests and needs of the citizens. And that puts a limit on the amount to which any incumbent political party can satisfy citizens' demands. So we might end up with a strong retrospective performance vote. The Moreno party, like others, will inevitably fail to deliver. And when it does, people might turn against it. So that's a possible exit from electoral authoritarianism that might be somewhat general beyond Mexico to other developing countries. Those are my best guesses for the moment.
Thank you, Ken. No, we very well understood your points in the keynote, but probably competitive authoritarianism is a more complex phenomenon. It is why I asked you the question. Zsolt, one more question for you, this time related to our region. We have a very visible case in our region of competitive authoritarianism or full-scale authoritarianism, whatever you want. It's a Vučić regime of Serbia now. Do you think? What do you think Serbian democracy fighters can draw something from the Hungarian experience, or is there can be any snowballing effect in this issue? Situation is different in two countries. Serbian opposition movement, and mostly driven by the students, a kind of a peaceful revolution, faces other challenges probably than Hungary, but not only these are neighboring countries, but can they draw some conclusions in their fight?
I hope so. I think Slovakia and Serbia are the two countries that could be most influenced by the outcome of the Hungarian elections. Even though I think that ultimately it's never what happens in the neighboring country that matters, but what happens in your own country. But there could be a momentum now for changing these regimes. In terms of how the Serbian opposition is structured today, obviously most people in the room know much more about that, but it seems to me that there is so much bitter rivalry and so much ideological uncertainty within the opposition that the possibility to replicate what happened when Milosevic was kicked out, when you did have 2-3 major solid actors who could come together and create some kind of front against the incumbent, that is less probable now. So it will be not so. Again, you cannot reach the transition simply by a couple of leaders sitting around the table and making a pact. It must be somehow more driven through grassroots mobilization, through emergence of perhaps leaders who have not been in politics in the past, but could become at least figureheads or actual leaders of the opposition. This is what happened with Magyar, in the sense that Magyar appeared first as a whistleblower, not as a political entrepreneur. He appeared as someone who knows some secret. He's ready to share that secret with us in order to create a freer society. Another interesting thing that one could learn from him, the key terms that he used, what he is speaking about is well-functioning and humane Hungary. Now, if you think about these two terms, well-functioning and humane, these are not left-wing terms. These are not right-wing terms. These are terms that have a resonance, have a kind of appeal, potentially, to everyone. And he tried to frame this message by first starting to speak about what it means in healthcare, what it means in education, so kind of very down to earth, very, very ordinary spheres, but immediately attaching a moral dimension to these things. He said that our grandmothers are dying in the hospital because the money is stolen, because there is a corrupt elite that is stealing the money. We have to create a healthcare where dignity is respected, where our relatives are not dying. We have to fight against the regime to get there.